Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. I am your host, Joe Kuzma, and I will be joined today with a first-time guest who runs Pittsburgh Sports Daily and is also the author of Takeaways, which is a Pittsburgh Steelers book coming out soon. You could pre-order it on Amazon. The name of the title of that book is Steelers Takeaways, Player Memories Through the Decades, where my guest has conducted over 400 interviews with former Pittsburgh Steelers players. I'd like to welcome my guest, Ron Lippock from Pittsburgh Sports Daily and the author of Takeaways. Ron, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, absolutely. And also, thank you for coming on the show. Just to become a little bit acquainted with Steelers Nation that's out there, some of the frequent listeners of the Steel City Underground podcast, and even some that are just jumping on and listening for the first time. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been in publishing actually for 25 years. Actually went to undergrad at Washington Jefferson College near Pittsburgh, which is actually where Roger Goodell, don't hate me for that, and Rooney's had gone to school as well. And I went to New York, came here to Washington, D.C., where I live now, but I've been doing all kinds of work for covering Pittsburgh sports and on my own with a newsletter that goes out to thousands of people and the website and now the book.
Yeah, the book itself now has over 400 different interviews with former Steelers in it, and this book will be releasing, I believe, the beginning of August. Is that correct?
That is right. And about August 11th is what I'm told by my publisher. Yes.
Okay. And this is a traditional hardback, paperback book, and
paperback. It's about 356 pages, if I'm not mistaken, and has pictures of old-time Steelers in it as well, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very cool. And when you go over to Ron's site, which is pghsportsdaily.com, he has a link for pre-orders of this book. If you want to get your hands on it in advance, make sure you reserve your copy. And you had a testimonial here from Andy Russell, actually, which was really, really cool.
Yeah, he had some nice comments. Terry Hanratty, the first Steelers quarterback, first-round draft pick before Terry Bradshaw, also did the foreword. And I've had some other Steelers like Chris Hoke and some other guys are going to do some testimonials as well. They're going to get those out to me. So got a lot of people willing to speak up for the book, which is really nice. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and that's really cool. And we were just discussing before I went on the air here that I'm 34 years old and you're 49. So it's fair to say that a lot of, even some of these interviews that I've seen that you've had over on your website and some that are going to be part of this book, there's some of these players I've forgot about or just haven't heard of. I mean, I almost feel like a terrible fan not knowing who these guys are. Would it be fair to say that maybe some of these guys you didn't see growing up? I'm not sure. Are there some interviews in there with some guys? There's some old-time Steelers. Maybe you had to look up some film, or the best we know is just through like newspaper clippings.
Well, a lot, because of a lot of the folks I've interviewed are from the early to mid-'60s, some from the '50s. There's a guy named Red Mack who played in the '60s. Probably about maybe 40 or so of the 400-plus interviews I've done are people who played before 1962.
Wow.
So these are guys that, yes, certainly, I didn't see play, and I'm happy to say that. But they've got great reputations, and they know a lot of them played for Vince Lombardi, so they had great stories about playing for Lombardi. They had, these are guys who almost started the whole NFL, and it's really fun to hear their stories of when they played for Pittsburgh, and they played at the old Latrobe Fields where they had one shower with one shower head and had to play on horse manure because no one really bothered to clean the fields because that's how they kept those conditions then. It's worldly change of how the game has changed now. So
yeah, speaking of, I was talking with someone on Twitter, I want to say not too long ago, and when I was just talking about even like they're talking about contracts, and I said I think Fran Tarkenton, I don't even know that he made $30,000, and that was considered a major, like he was one of the most highest paid players I think of his time at that time. So just in terms of even salaries, playing conditions, I mean it's some really cool, really cool stuff. When you contacted some of these players, how did they necessarily react to that? Because they might have been like, "Oh, did you see this game, or do you remember this?" And I would sit there in a fog. It's truly, it's incredible. I'm amazed by this whole concept that you have going on here.
Well, I appreciate that, and really, the people that I've spoken to, the questions I ask, I try to be different. I don't try to ask them what their favorite play was, what their most memorable year was. I'm trying to ask them about how they dealt with the issues of the time. A lot of what these interviews cover are things like race, humor in the locker room. How did you guys, what jokes did you play on each other? How did race and religion impact your time? Because, in the early 70s, people like J.T. Thomas, they spoke a lot about how race and religion affected the team, and how it was actually a pastor who brought the team together in the 70s as much as some of the other guys did. And he wasn't even affiliated with the team, but it was just some pastor who knew a lot of the players and brought them together every Saturday or Sunday, I forget which, and they all got to know each other well and bonded black and white, which at that time wasn't always happening. So things like this were, the kind of questions I'd ask that went beyond the whole, favorite play thing. So when when I didn't see them play, I think that didn't matter to them, because we were asking different kinds of questions about how the game progressed over the course of time, how they were affected by the physicality of the game, things that weren't specific to that, to a particular play or a moment of their career.
Wow, yeah, the physicality part's got to be interesting, because just the change and the evolution of the equipment. I mean, you look at just the helmets and even like your pads and everything. And it's got to be amazing to hear some of these stories. I mean, I remember some of the guys that didn't have face masks, or even the kickers that used to wear the one bar that was grandfathered in, and some of those guys were allowed to keep them. I think Morton Anderson may have been one of the last players that wore that, if I remember correctly. So that was really neat. With over 400 interviews, I got to think, and I got to ask, how long did it take you to put this book together?
Well, it took years, because I started over 5 years ago with the newsletter, and when I had enough readers to make it credible enough for someone to want to even talk to me, because these people don't have to talk to me, right? They're not, they're not doing me, I'm not doing them a huge favor by interviewing them. But what happens is, over the course of time, if you've a large enough following, you can approach a player and say, hey, this cause that you have, this work that you do, this image that you want to portray, we have enough people to make it worthwhile to be seen in front of all these people. So that's a little bit of a way to coerce someone to work with you a bit. But a lot of them just wanted to be seen and heard again. Again, these guys from the 50s and 60s, the guy like Red Mack, this is a wide receiver that played, I believe, in like 1961 for the Steelers, and he called it the forgotten years. He said he doesn't get asked back. He doesn't get acknowledged. And the fact that someone reaches out to him, or an O.C. Austin or Brady Keys, these old guys that were fundamental to the team at the time, but now you don't know their names. These guys love to be spoken to again, because they want to be remembered. They were a part of a past that was forgotten, and they don't want to be part of a past. They want to be remembered. So reaching out to these folks was great. And then the newer guys, the Lynn Swans that we've spoken to, or the Hines Ward, Antoine Randall, Tommy Maddox, all these guys, Cordell Stewart, a lot of them have things that they want to speak to, so that's part of their conversation. They'll have missions, they'll have goals, they'll have things happening in their lives that they're proud of and they want to speak out about. So it takes a lot of time to get all these interviews done. But a lot of the folks turn them around pretty quickly. They're not so shy about talking. And those that are, there are some of those, and you just have to work at them. I mean, I just interviewed Louis Lifts a short while ago, and I think I've been going back and forth with him for 2 years. It's just, hey, this is a great time. Oh, wait, no, sorry, 2 minutes before the interview. Sorry, I can't make it after all. Sorry. And then happens over again. These things happen all the time.
So, was Louis the hardest one to secure, or was there someone that was even more difficult that you would find? Because I imagine, like you were saying, nobody off the street can just come up and say, hey, you know what, I'd like to do this interview. And with football being kind of the unforgiving business that it is, a lot of people forget players that were just on the team maybe 5 years ago. Maybe they weren't like a superstar player. Like you throw out a name like Lynn Swann or Hines Ward or some player like that. Most people, that's fresh in their mind because these were major, like contributors, franchise players, Pro Bowlers, etc., guys who won Super Bowls. But like those, like forgotten years, as you had said, I have to think that some of those may have been, or there may have been someone that was much harder to secure because they said, well, who is this guy? And, why do I really need to do this? Was there one guy in particular?
Yeah. Well, Hines Ward is difficult. Anyone who goes through an agent was difficult. And one thing I make sure I do is the people that I interview aren't current players, because what I found is that those players don't really, they can't really speak their mind. They're, it's like asking you about your boss. Mm-hmm. You're not going to say, oh, my boss is terrible, and then go to work the next day and see that headline all over your work, your workplace. I speak to the people who just retired, so they're a little more willing to talk because they don't have any fear of repercussion. But having said that, a lot of these guys are still big names, the Hines Wards and that sort of thing. So Hines Ward, Lynn Swann, those are guys I did have to jump through a few more hoops for. Some guys are just hard to get to, like Louis Lips, who's a great guy, really nice, wasn't doing anything wrong or anything. He's busy. So these are the kinds of things you do have to go through. And so, those are some of the guys that took a little longer because of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Just me and you trying to get together to do this show. I mean, exactly,
Well, we all have lives, right? I mean, imagine that.
Yeah, it's just going nonstop. A lot of people don't think that, and they're just like, well, this guy was a football player, but, he's still, they've got things going on. And a lot of these guys, I'll actually jump to before I ask you that one of my favorite guys and you did an interview with is Tommy Maddox. And the reason Tommy Maddox was interesting to me is for those who know, and I let the cat out of the bag maybe a few shows ago about being into wrestling and the whole WWE thing. I think it was about Mark Madden, and I was talking about him, and he used to be involved with pro wrestling too, God forbid. Mm-hmm. So Tommy Maddox, with the link to WWE, of course, was Vince McMahon started the XFL. And Tommy Maddox goes and he plays in the XFL. I think it was for the LA Extreme, and the only year that they have with that league, and it folds afterwards, but he wins a championship and he's the league MVP. And then he was he was asking around for a tryout. He was approaching all these different teams that go to camp, and the Steelers were the ones that gave him a shot. And then, being of that age, that was probably around the early 2000s. And so, I'm just kind of that in that demographic of the pro wrestling fan. They like their, 13 to 35 or something like that. So I was probably like 18, 19 years old. And I'm like, oh, how cool is this? I'm paying attention to this Vince McMahon owned league. And here's this Tommy Maddox. And now he just won championship in the MVP here. And he's coming to the Steelers. And it ended up working out for him. And I just thought it was a really cool interview. And of course, he talks about his life after football and how it wasn't an easy transition. And I've got to ask, that's probably common with a lot of the guys that you interviewed, but if that was my favorite interview being Tommy Maddox, did you have one that in particular that stuck out as your favorite?
Well, there are a few for different reasons. Gary Dunn was hysterical. He had some great stories that he and Mike Webster fighting on the side of the turnpike because Mike Webster made him look bad in practice. John Kolb, who was an offensive lineman who was just this incredibly spiritual, insightful guy. You see these tough physical guys you see them on the field, and then this guy, he's like a savant. I mean, just a really incredibly brilliant spiritual guy. And speaking to him, that was interesting. J.T. Thomas, because of his introduction of how sort of that race and religion all came together at the right time in the early 70s to bring this team together in ways that I never knew. Interesting, Troy Edwards was an interesting one for me because here's a guy, number one draft pick, wide receiver, great talent, never really panned out. And you talk to these guys and you think, oh yeah, he's going to say the system was bad. He's going to say that, he never got a chance. And what he said instead was, yeah, you know what, I blew it. I should have listened to Hines Ward. He was telling me what to do, and I was too rebellious, and I didn't listen, and I blew it. And to hear that kind of honesty and contrite behavior, these guys were all almost to a player, really transparent, really open. And that really surprised me how open and transparent they were, because, they're telling me things that, it's surprising for them to say. And it was really nice to be able to capture that.
Yeah, you know what? I read the Troy Edwards piece over on Behind the Steel Curtain, where you're also sharing some of these interviews in addition to running PGHSportsDaily.com. And I did see that with Troy Edwards, and it was a very good piece, and it's a good snippet for this entire book if anyone wants to go check it out on either of the sites. Ron and myself, both contributors over with BehindTheSteelCurtain.com, who may be running this podcast as a simulcast as well. So I wanted to get back to just something that I was thinking about too, is in securing these interviews and saying, this one's the most difficult one to get and this and that, really there had to be the first one that you did, the one that got the ball rolling. Maybe the light bulb went off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. How'd that come about? Who was the first one, and how did this all get started?
Well, Stan Savran, oddly enough, was the first personality, for lack of a better way to say it, that I interviewed. He was really gracious to be that first one, open with his time. It was just a fun interview to talk to him about the profession, the broadcasting profession, and about sports. From there, the first player afterwards was, I think, Walter Abercrombie, who, it was a basic interview. That got the ball rolling because it gave me the sort of the format for what I wanted to ask and why I wanted to ask it. Everyone wants to be different, and everyone wants to ask different questions. But I think what I'm able to do, because I'm not speaking to the current players, I'm able to ask questions and get answers from guys that normally wouldn't answer as open and honestly and give me such insight as a guy who's currently in the league. So you get the stories from the locker room, you get the stories about guys who hated their coaches. Roy Jefferson and Chuck Noll were like oil and water, as an example, and that's why Ward Jefferson was traded away.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt there, but Jefferson is an intriguing one, because most people don't realize how great of a wide receiver he was, both not only with the Steelers, but when he went over to the Chargers. Is that correct? I
think the Chargers are the Redskins, or maybe both.
Yeah, he may have jumped around a little bit there, and he was pretty much an all-pro before the whole Super Bowl run with Noel and everything got started. And you would have thought, you could just imagine if he would have stuck around and been there with like Swan and Stallworth. We may not even know who Swan and Stallworth are if Jefferson had hung around. So, that's an interesting name to bring up there too. And I had to think, with getting the ball rolling and having that first interview, going back to Troy Edwards, is that the story that surprised you the most, or was it someone like Jefferson? Or
I think there's a lot of stories that surprised in probably different ways. I think Troy Edwards' openness and why he didn't succeed surprised me. And what surprised me too is, all the things that you hear about with the Rooneys, and how terrible they were. It grew almost to mythical proportions, and you believe it, but right, you think, everyone loved the Rooneys. I'm sure they're great people, but they had their faults, and they did. But the depth of how well they treated people and their players was not understated. I mean, it was, or not overstated. It was really remarkable. I mean, I interviewed, one of the earlier interviews was with an offensive lineman named Brian Blankenship. Not a household name, but he was, starting offensive lineman. But he was negotiating his second contract with the team, and he found out that he couldn't play anymore. He had an injury to his, I think, neck or spine, and he told his agent, "I just got the doctor's report. I cannot play anymore." And he told the agent, and the agent said, "Well, just don't say anything. Just go sign your contract first, and then you can tell them afterwards." And he said, "I can't do that." And he went and told the chief, and the chief said, "Well, how far along were you in that contract process?" And he said, "Well, we had agreed on it, but now I can't play." And he said, "Go across the office and sign the contract."
Wow.
And that's the kind of, that can't happen today because of cap situations. But, to hear stories like that, that's the kind of stuff that, it reaffirms this myth that you sort of feel as a myth. So that was a big thing. That's some of the things that surprised me. And also just the ingenuity of the team. I mean, I interviewed a few of the coaches, or a lot of the coaches actually. and Lou Riecke, who was the the weightlifting coach in the early 70s. There was Dan Radakovich, who was an offensive line coach, and then a defensive line coach, oddly enough, for the team. They all spoke about the ingenuity of the team and how much innovation occurred. This team was successful as much because of innovation, how it scouted, innovation, and it developed everything from the concussion test to implement trap blocking, the 3-4 defense it implemented early in the history of the NFL. This team succeeded as much because of innovation as it did anything else. And that's something that surprised me, and you heard that across the spectrum of these interviews.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because later in this week, I'm going to be working on an episode just talking about the Steelers being on the cutting edge when it comes to any type of advantage they could get in the NFL. And some of that is last year they had the most 2-point conversion attempts in the league. And I think they're also trying to get ahead of the curve when it comes to the kick return game and selecting someone like a DeMarcus Ayers and having Eli Rogers in camp. And I'll be talking about the whole Antonio Brown returning punts type debate too. But right back onto the Steelers takeaways, the player memories through the decades and all of these interviews, I have to ask now, because you mentioned even like a strength or conditioning coach, who's the most obscure guy? Throw out a name that somebody's going to be like, who is that? Because I'm sure mentioning even the strength and conditioning guy from the 70s, even the most hardcore fans are going to be like, well, who is that?
Well, there are a lot, because some of the best stories are from the guys that were barely made the practice team, much less the roster, the top roster, because they're the stories that had all the struggles. So there's a guy named Jaheen Arnold, who played for a couple of years, a wide receiver. And his story was great because in the middle of the story, I learned that he's got Walter Payton's disease.
Oh, wow.
And, and he's got 2 kids that he's raising. And so to hear that story and the plight, because that's not a pleasant story, but, stories like that where, these guys all have great stories. And sometimes it's not the Hines Ward was even a 3rd round pick, but sometimes it's not the 1st round draft pick guys that have the stories that you really appreciate most. Sometimes it's the guys who knew their role, did everything they could just to maintain a roster spot. The Matt Cushings who get cut and rehired, probably more than a dozen times in a few years span. Ross Ventron, who I actually haven't interviewed, but is the guy that's got cut more than anyone else in the NFL right now, and he's still employed. These guys are just hanging on. And all they want to do is get to another team and just hang on the best they can. And their stories, their perseverance, their way to hang on through, the years is remarkable to me. The effect it has on their families, the effect it has on, the things that people don't think about. Moving from team to team to team and moving your families from team to team to team just to stay alive one more year. It's those are stories that I really appreciate.
Yeah, and it truly is a thing of survival. I think I just did a piece about all the different Steelers players that were kind of on the bubble, and of course, I actually had people yell at me about using Ross Ventrone as like kind of the poster child for that, and I want to say the number for him. He's had, I think, 41 or 42 total NFL transactions. I think he came in the league in 2010. He's only been with the Steelers and Patriots, but he's been cut, re-signed, released, promoted, and whatnot that many times, which is just incredible when you read it. And you're just like, wow, it's for those latter maybe 10 to 15 guys on the roster, they're always fighting, biting, clawing to keep their spot. So a lot of times, in what you'll see in the interviews and some of the names that pop up here in Ron's book, these guys may not necessarily pop up off the page because they're part of that, I don't know what you want to call it, casualty list or something like that, where they're always back and forth. Besides Ross, one of the guys that's kind of in that danger zone right now is like David Johnson, for example. He used to be with the Steelers, and now he's back after a short stint with the Chargers. And, well, this is a little bit different than asking you your favorite interview that you had. But I see some of the names, the ones that do pop off the page, like L.C. Greenwood, Donnie Shell. We talked about Tommy Maddox. You had Rocky Blyer, Antoine Randall L. So, of the names that are all on this list, the 400 plus, which was the one that you said, I absolutely must get this one? This is the one that I must have, no matter what. Well,
it's going to sound funny because he's probably not the household name, but it's I used to, look, I'm 5'8" on a good day, and my junior high school football days was, they lasted a blink of an eye. But when I played, Dennis Winston was my favorite guy. Dirt Winston. He was the guy. People used to call me Dirt when I played because I just loved him so much. That's who I emulated. And so when I got to interview him, that was a personal favorite for me because it was just a kick to be able to interview this guy that you emulated. And normally, in every interview you try to be professional, but you had that little giddy feeling getting to talk to a guy like that. I mean, Elsie Greenwood was amazing because I didn't even know that interview was going to happen. He called me when I was at work and I was about to go to a meeting, and that meeting never happened because I'm talking to Elsie Greenwood. And that was right before the Hall of Fame ballot, shortly before he passed away, and he was lobbying to make the Hall of Fame. He was really, really adamant that he make it, and unfortunately he didn't. But he called in part because I think he felt like I want to talk to this guy and he can maybe help amongst everything else that I'm doing. He can nudge something somewhere somehow to, get in front of some media person's eyes to get some more consideration. So that was another big win.
Yeah. So when you spoke with Dirt, did you mention that to him that like, hey, it was a big childhood thing, or was it more because I know you've been doing this for a very long time, over 25 years? Was it something where did you kind of like let the professionalism and the personal feelings kind of blend there and let him know, hey, you know what, I really looked up to you as a kid. You were like my role model, and like what did he have to say about that if you did?
I think he did at the end. I think I did at the end, if I remember, because this was an interview maybe 4 years ago. But I think I did at the end, and I think if I remember, he got a kick out of it. He was actually coaching. I'm not sure if he still is, but I think he had an appreciation because of the coaching aspect too. That this guy that emulated him is still gets it and still appreciates who he is and what he did for the game.
Yeah, that's really cool. And speaking of, I have two questions here for you. Just mentioning like Elsie Greenwood passing away. Let's start first with players who are still alive, surviving players that, you have over 400 interviews, but there's probably one or two that you didn't get that you would have liked to have had, aside from guys who are currently with the team, which is a good point because, the Steelers really restrict a lot of the media access controls. They're very tight on press credentials and things of that nature. And as we've seen with like D'Angelo Williams running his mouth on Twitter, Mike Tomlin has to come in and be, the whatever you want to call it, father figure.
The Twitter police.
Yeah, the Twitter police, and tell them, hey, you know what, cool it. So we understand that, but maybe guys that aren't currently with the team, I'm sure you probably want everybody that's there, like a Big Ben or somebody like that would be awesome to get. But of the surviving players that are former Steelers, which one kind of doesn't sit so well with you that you weren't able to obtain?
I think there are a couple. I mean, look, there are a number of well-known players out there that that are still to be had because the number increases every year. But I think Mel Blount is the guy that I would like to have spoken to. And oddly enough, Eric Green, the tight end, who I think was, I thought his story was so amazing just because he came from the small Baptist school, no less, not known for football, certainly at Liberty, and became a number one draft pick, excels, doing great, and then he ran into those hardships. And he lost everything that he was set to, trying to achieve. And I think the guy had so much talent that I would love to have been able to talk to him, and still will. I mean, I'm still doing these interviews, even post-book. I'd love to talk to him and find out what happened. Those are the stories that intrigue me because those are the real human interest, the real personal stories of, that's real life. And, I'd like to find out what happened there.
Yeah, you know what? It's very cool that you mentioned Eric Green and you mentioned Liberty University. I actually know Liberty University. I want to say that they were playing, and I've mentioned this on previous shows, I grew up following my local hometown college. It is one of those 1AA schools, Youngstown State University, and I think they used to play Liberty here or there, and like the Stephen F. Austins and, those type of colleges in the early 90s. And I just remember I was probably about 10, 11 years old, so I'm just getting into football, and Eric Green was like one of my favorite players, and because he was a tight end, he was probably the best player, one of the best players on the offensive side of the ball during that period of time. He was a two-time Pro Bowler. I absolutely loved Eric Green growing up. Whenever the Browns fans used to run their mouth, oh, we have Eric Metcalf and Bernie and all this, and they'd make fun of, Bubby Brister or whoever he had throwing the ball back there. It was, it wasn't necessarily the best time growing up as a kid as a Steelers fan until several years later when Cowher took over. But Eric Green was definitely one of those guys where I could point at and I could be proud and say, well, who's good that's on your team? And you say, hey, Eric Green, and I pointed him, and I it was almost like I was following all these little small colleges and knew where these colleges were, so I kind of took a liking to Eric Green in the same way that I took a liking to Tommy Maddox just for that XFL and Vince McMahon connection. So
that underdog feel, yeah,
absolutely. And of course, the second part of this question is there are guys you're just impossible to go back and interview because they're no longer with us. If there's one player that's deceased that you wish you could go back and speak to, who would it be?
Well, I'd love to. I reached out to Bill Nunn shortly before he passed away, and that just never happened, obviously. And I would have loved to have spoken to him because he was such a linchpin in all that 70s growth. I mean, he was, an instrumental part in that whole scouting process. And I'd spoken to some guys who scouted along the same time as he did, but he was the guy. He was the architect for, determining the bet, finding those guys. And I would have loved to be able to speak to him. And Mike Webster, of course, just because, I would love to understand more. I think we all would about, what happened with him, what happened with the finances, what happened with his health. And I mean, we know to a good degree what happened in terms of causation, but just to understand more about the man because he was such a complex human being, and to be able to speak to him and to get to understand him as a person would have been really fascinating, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think even more so being relevant with the movie Concussion that came out last year, that really kind of put the whole Mike Webster thing in the limelight, even more so than, a lot of people who aren't regionally around the Pittsburgh area and hearing the Mike Webster stories leading up to his demise, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Probably.
And I spoke to... I spoke to a John Hilton a couple years ago, who was a tight end for Pittsburgh in the '60s, and it's sad. The whole concussion thing it's a huge thing. This is a guy, John Hilton, who was a well-known tight end at the time, very great, talented guy. And when I interviewed him, every 10 minutes the interview restarted because he suffered from dementia, and every 10 minutes that's what he had to offer until his wife had to step in and say, "Okay, we have to cancel the interview or stop the interview at this point." Because that's all, it's almost like the tape. It would just restart every 10 minutes. And that's, these concussion stories are, they're not over. They're still affecting people, and they will affect people well past what we know now because there's more people getting them every day, and dementia will occur unfortunately and horribly with some of these players again. Those stories are things that we still need to understand better.
Was that the most difficult interview that you had in terms of actually... I'm not sure, just in terms of it being difficult with interviewing the person on the other side, or perhaps there was just someone that just didn't want to cooperate. And you don't necessarily have to name drop. I'm not, airing dirty laundry or anything here,
right.
But I just think it'd be interesting to hear because that's just fascinating just thinking about that and having a movie like Concussion fresh in my mind and thinking about those guys like Mike Webster and was it Justin Strelzik, I think was another one that was shown in that movie as well. So when you're thinking of guys like that, I couldn't even imagine speaking to someone that fits that criteria in the present day and just going, oh my gosh, that's just, it's beyond my imagination, I should say.
That was the most, one of the most difficult. There's another gentleman by the name of Gene Breen who I think is doing much better. He's in Florida and doing some really interesting techniques to try to get him through the dementia that he suffered. But, it would be great stories, great conversations, and then he'd slip into sort of this anger. And then his wife would say, please don't use that as part of the interview because we don't need to tell stories of him and that thing he did. But moving on to then he would tell more stories, and then he'd slip into another angry fit. And, again, this is another guy suffering from dementia, at least in part. In terms of players being difficult outside of that type of concept, most of the guys weren't. I mean, if they're going to talk to you, they're going to talk to you, and they're not. I've had a gentleman by the name of O.C. Austin, another early '60s guy who felt he was banned from the NFL, as was another guy by the name of Brady Keys, due to racial concerns and things of this nature. Those are a little bit difficult because it's always uncomfortable, but they're important stories. So O.C. Austin was one of my first interviews where I really ran into that kind of thing, and that I found very interesting because you didn't hear a lot of that. Then you hear, then you start talking about race as in the not the positive way that a J.T. Thomas spoke to it as a unifying concept. Instead, this was hey, I was banned because of this, and that's everyone has their own experiences, and they were real.
Yeah, it's very sad to hear anything like that. And of course, all of these stories in the book. And of course, I'm sure there's a lot that's in the book, 400 plus interviews and probably lots more. You got the foreword, you have all the different testimonials that are also going to be a part of that. And also, not to neglect the website. You have a great website going on. There's probably going to be more, I imagine, more interviews and more stories being released over a period of time well beyond this book. What exactly do you have, Ron, in your book that someone isn't just going to say, you know what, I could just read this on pghsportsdaily.com?
Well, there's a couple things. First, there's content in the book that is not on the site for that reason. But there are also a number of, there are probably 700 interviews of, not just players, but I've interviewed musicians like Rusted Root and the local guys like Norm Rondini, and interviewed media folks. So there are 700 plus interviews on the site and growing. There's a lot more that haven't been posted that are in the book. So what I've done in the book is I've treated the book very differently than the website would be treated. And in that, I've categorized all the interviews by topic, taking excerpts out of each interview, broken them out by topic. So if you wanted to learn about all the crazy antics that have occurred on and off the field, which there were many, that's one section. If you want to learn about spirituality or religion, that's another section. You can't cut through the website that way. It's just not, there's no way to do that. So the way the book is designed, and the fact that you can take the book and read it, in your hands, and in terms of, getting a full scope of those different topics and just pouring through it that way, it's a completely different animal than a website.
That sounds amazing. And of course, the book going on sale early August, available now for pre-sale. Let us know, Ron, where can we pick this up if interested?
It'll be in Pittsburgh bookstores, but it's on Amazon now for pre-order. I think it's on B. Dalton as well on pre-order, but definitely on Amazon. So encourage people to go there. And if you can't find it, you can certainly find it through my website, because it's on the first post on the website. But it shouldn't be hard to find if you look up Steelers takeaways. It will come up, and we're selling a lot already, which is great because it's not out yet. But the pre-order is definitely there for you, and that way you're sure to get a copy.
Very cool. And you know what else I'm going to do? If you end up going to steelcityunderground.com and you click on the podcast, there's a whole podcast page there, and you look up this episode here with Ron Lippock of Pittsburgh Sports Daily. I will include a link that you could find the pre-order, at least on Amazon. If not, you could start looking in bookstores right around perfect timing as football season is getting ready to roll here at the beginning of August. Definitely hope that you strike gold here, Ron. I think that you already have, and if this interview hasn't piqued anyone's interest, it certainly has for me. I'll definitely be picking up my own copy. Any other takeaways from this interview today, Ron?
No, I appreciate you having me on. If anyone has any ideas on things they want me to cover, or any thoughts about anything that we do, let me know. You reach out to me. My email address is on my site. It's not hard to find, and I'd love to hear from you. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, you can just email me as well, and it's a free daily newsletter that covers all of Pittsburgh sports. So all that stuff is there for you, and I appreciate any feedback you have.
Yeah, and also Ron's on Twitter, and you'll see that we're always going back and forth and retweeting each other and talking. Just if you want to jump in and join the conversation along with Steel City Underground with my vowelless Steel City Undergur and the Twitter handle at Pittsburgh Sport, not plural, just Pittsburgh Sport. You can find Ron there, and you'll see we're always talking back and forth. Ron, it was great having you on. Thank you for taking some time out of your holiday weekend. Until next time, be safe, be good, and I will catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.